Dr. Craig, when is belief in miracles rational? And that's the name of this article. We'll look at that. There's a section in your book, Reasonable Faith, that deals with the problem, so-called, of miracles. And this is an article on Slate by Hans Halverson, a professor of philosophy at Princeton University, whom you know. What do you know?
Yes, we were together at a philosophy of physics conference at the University of St Andrews in Scotland a couple of years ago, and he is a specialist in quantum mechanics and philosophy of physics. So very bright, young philosopher, and so interesting to see what he has to say on this subject.
Well, it is interesting because when I read this article, the first part of it, he's discounting miracles, it seems, and then in the last part of it, he says, but yeah, it is rational to believe. So let's see what point he's trying to make here. He starts out the article by saying, a recent New York Times bestseller presents numerous accounts of surprising events in the lives of everyday people, arguing that these events were miracles. Should you believe it? My answer here is simple. For any event you experience in your life, no matter how strange, surprising, or wonderful, you should not believe that it is a miracle. Similarly, if somebody tells you that a miracle occurred, you should not believe them. Really? What if an oncologist is 100% certain that her patient has terminal cancer and cannot possibly recover, and yet when that person's church holds a prayer vigil, miraculously the next day the cancer is gone? Would it be rational to suppose that a miracle occurred? I'm sorry to sound harsh, but the answer is no. The oncologist and everybody else should continue believing that there is a perfectly cogent scientific explanation for the patient's recovery. Now, he goes on to say, am I not condoning a highly irrational attitude, namely a bias against supernatural explanations? Isn't there a point at which an unbiased observer ought to admit that the evidence points toward a supernatural intervention? Again, I claim that the answer is no. Well, let's stop there for just a moment, Bill. I mean, certainly there are terms like miracles that we kind of toss around and are not very precise, and we say he had a miracle finish, or miracle shot, made 2 points at the buzzer. And we use the term miracle actually when we just mean it was amazing or exciting or breathtaking or even something providential in God's providence and so on. So perhaps we're not very precise in what we mean by miracles?
Well, that's certainly true. And it's interesting to me that Halverson in this article, as it comes to light on the second to the last paragraph, thinks of miracles as violations of the laws of nature. Now that is, I think, an untenable definition of what a miracle is, as the philosophical literature on miracles points out. Miracles are not violations of the laws of nature. The laws of nature describe what would happen in a particular case, assuming that there are no intervening supernatural factors. They have these what are called ceteris paribus clauses implicit in them, namely, all things being equal, this is what will happen in this situation. But if all things are not equal, the law isn't violated. Rather, the law just doesn't apply to that situation because there are other factors at work. And in the case of a miracle, God doesn't violate the laws of nature when he does a miracle. Rather, there will be causal factors at work, namely God, which are supernatural, and therefore what the laws of nature predict won't happen because the laws of nature only make predictions under the assumption that there are no intervening supernatural factors at work. So a miracle, I think properly defined, is an event which the natural causes at a time and place cannot produce at that time and place. Or more succinctly, a miracle is a naturally impossible event, an event which the natural causes at a certain time and place cannot bring about. It's beyond the productive capacity of nature.
Okay. And again, let's distinguish. You've made this distinction before. Some things are perhaps in answer to prayer or in the life of the believer are God's providence, but not necessarily a miracle.
Correct. A special providence need not be something that is naturally impossible. If you pray, for example, that your boss will give you a raise and he does, that might be a special providence, but we don't need to think that God caused neurons to fire in his brain that wouldn't have fired otherwise to make the decision to give you a raise. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about events which would not take place were the natural causes alone operative at that time and place. And what Halverson is arguing here is reminiscent of David Hume's argument against the identification of miracles. I'm very disappointed, frankly, to see this argument on the lips of a contemporary Christian philosopher. He's not denying that people can be healed from cancer, or that Jesus might rise from the dead, or that the Red Sea might suddenly part at Moses' verbal command, or think of the most outlandish sort of event that you could imagine. This New York Empire State Building levitating 50 feet above the ground and then settling back down again. He's not denying that these events could occur and that we could have good reason, good evidence to believe they occurred. He's just saying that if these things occurred, you cannot say that was a miracle. That was something that was wrought by God. So he's not denying that the evidence can show these events happened, but he's saying you can't say that event was a miracle. It had a supernatural cause.
He does sound like Hume when he says that for all I know, miracles happen every day. But what I'm saying is that seeing an event as a miracle is to treat that event as falling outside the bounds of science, and there is no amount of evidence that could force us to take such a stance. That sounds a little like Hume, doesn't it?
Yeah, oh, very much so. And notice how he has shifted or moved the goalpost here. Before, he was talking about whether it might be rational to believe that a miracle has occurred, that some event is a miracle. But now he's using language of forcing. It cannot force you to believe that a miracle. And then look at the next sentence. What kind of evidence would someone need in order to be rationally compelled to say that an event is a miracle? Now, the defenders of miracles, I don't think, ever use language like you're rationally compelled to believe this is a miracle, or that you're forced to believe a miracle. Rather, they would say it's plausible that this is a miracle, or it's more plausible than not that this is a miracle. In the next sentence, he says that person would have to know that this event could not possibly be explained by future science. Not at all. It seems to me the defender of miracle would say it's unlikely that this is to be explained by future science. So Halverson here has shifted in the terminology now so that the defender of miracles is supposed to be able to provide rationally compelling reasons that would force a person to believe in miracles, that show that this event could not possibly be explained in some other way, and that is to lay upon the shoulders of the defenders of miracles a burden of proof which he would reject and which is quite unreasonable. The defender of miracles has merely to show that this event is plausibly a miracle, or that it's rational to identify this as a miracle or something. So that's the first point to make, is that he's shifting the goalpost, or setting the bar now at a different height than what he was when he began. Now, the second thing to be said is, notice what his argument is here. Is he saying that rather than to believe that the event was a miracle, you simply say, well, there was some unknown law of nature that would explain this. The event is naturally explicable, but I don't know what it is.
Wait long enough and we'll find out.
And we'll find out. And so you would never be justified in thinking the event is a miracle. That's a very old argument. That goes back to Spinoza, much less David Hume, against the identification of miracles. And as Richard Swinburne points out, that sort of skepticism would be quite unwarranted when we have a sufficiently clear grasp of what the laws of nature are, so as to have a pretty good idea that this event is naturally impossible, that this couldn't be explained by some future science. And so, as Swinburne says, if such an event were to occur, we don't revise the natural law. It would look ad hoc. It would be very unwieldy. You would only revise the natural law if the event in question were to take place repeatedly whenever those conditions obtained. Otherwise, the scientist will not revise the natural law in question. So what would lead you to think that an event is a miracle? Well, I think it would not simply be that the event cannot be explained by the laws of nature, because scientific anomalies can occur, and you don't revise the laws, but you just say, well, we don't know in this case what happened. I think what would justify you in thinking that it's a miracle is when it occurs in a significant religio-historical context that tips you off that this is a miracle. So, for example, the events in the life of Jesus, like feeding the 5,000, walking on the water, his resurrection from the dead, are, I think, very plausibly miraculous events when given the significant religio-historical context in which they occurred. Jesus' own radical personal claims and ministry make it, I think, very plausible that these are miracles. In fact, I have to say, Kevin, I can't think of a single skeptic or critic who says, yes, I think that Jesus really did rise from the dead, but this was just a purely natural event. I mean, given the nature of the resurrection and the religio-historical context in which it occurs, I think it's very plausible that if the resurrection happened, it was probably a miracle.
Yeah, it wasn't some guy, Joe down the block, who rose. It was Jesus.
Right, who had claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of Man, the Son of God, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims.
Wow. And he seems to be saying this, I mean, a little bit later. He says, technically, I'm just going to jump down a little bit here, Bill. He says, technically, what I just said contradicts my earlier claim, because he says that he thinks you can believe miracle claims in the Bible. He says, technically, what I just said contradicts my earlier claim that you ought never to believe that an event was a miracle. So let me amend that claim. You ought never believe that a miraculous event occurred unless such a claim is an integral part of a religious narrative, the whole of which is rational to believe.
Yeah,
okay, so,
and that's exactly the point I'm making about occurring within a significant religio-historical context that tips you off that it's a miracle. But I don't think Halverson really understands this, Kevin, because he goes on to give the example of the story of Lazarus rising from the dead. And how does he respond to this? He doesn't say, given the historical context of Jesus' radical personal claims and powers and other miracle claims, it's rational to believe that Lazarus' coming back from the dead was a miracle. That's not what Halverson says. He says, rather, what we should say is, yes, Lazarus came back from the dead, but we really don't know if there is a law of nature that says dead men don't rise again. So you still can't say that it was a miracle that Lazarus rose from the dead. You can be rational, believe Lazarus did rise from the dead, but you cannot say God raised Lazarus from the dead. And that's just to repeat his earlier point. So I don't think he really gets it with regard to the way in which a significant religio-historical context can tip you off to identifying an anomalous event as a miracle.
Let me back up to where we were. He says, again, to declare that an event was a miracle would be tantamount to saying, I'm simply not going to try to understand this event in scientific terms. He says, now there are perfectly good reasons to give up on seeing events in scientific terms, but these reasons have to do with human desires, not with evidence. So I say, as long as you're trying to see the world scientifically, then you should refuse to believe that any event is a miracle. Maybe he's trying to exaggerate the point a little bit and say, if you're just going to look at things strictly scientifically, you can always say, we'll find out later in future science, find out it wasn't so miraculous after all.
There's 2 points to be made here. First is that this is a bad argument against miracles. What he's saying is to believe in miracles is bad for science. It's a sort of science stopper.
Yeah, science stopper.
If you say that an event is a miracle, he says that's tantamount to saying, I'm not going to try to understand this in scientific terms. And that is simply patently false, Kevin. When a scientist proposes a hypothesis, he then delineates conditions which would falsify that hypothesis. And then he will test to see whether he can falsify his hypothesis. And if the hypothesis survives these attempts at falsification, that corroborates the hypothesis and makes it all the stronger. Well, similarly, someone who believes that an event is a miracle will be very open to trying to explain it away as due to psychological or other sorts of factors, because these are, in effect, attempts at falsification. And if the hypothesis survives these tests, the miracle hypothesis will be corroborated. So by no means is believing that an event is a miracle a science stopper or a refusal to look at alternative ways to explain it scientifically. The second point is that his rephrasing here is almost tautologous, as I think you said. It's almost true by definition. As long as you're trying to see the world scientifically, then you should refuse to believe that any event is a miracle. What that seems to say is, as long as you only look at the world as being explicable through science, you should never believe in a miracle. Well, duh. I mean, that's right, because a miracle is naturally inexplicable, right? It's a naturally impossible event. So if you're only trying to look at the world naturally, you will not believe in naturally impossible events. Sure, but that's a tautology. The question is, should we be open to the possibility that events could be identified that are not naturally explicable?
You've always pointed out as well that the religio-historical context gives weight to the evidence, in a sense, that it certainly grounds it in more rational terms and increases the evidence for it.
Well, I would prefer to put it this way. I think that the religio-historical context helps to provide the interpretive context for identifying an event as a miracle. The religio-historical context of the empty tomb doesn't itself increase the evidence for the empty tomb. The evidence for the empty tomb comes from the literary testimonial evidence that we have, that I've delineated in my work on the resurrection, that has convinced the vast majority of New Testament scholars that the empty tomb of Jesus is a historical fact. And the fact that that occurs in a religio-historical context doesn't make that evidence any better. We already have good evidence the tomb was found empty.
Okay.
What it does is it gives you a clue to how to interpret the empty tomb. To say, wait a minute, maybe this is a miracle. Maybe God raised Jesus from the dead, and that's why the tomb is empty. Yeah. So a miracle claim in the absence of a religio-historical context is inherently ambiguous because it could just be a bald scientific anomaly. We need something that will tip us off to its supernatural character.
Let me bring up another old chestnut, Bill. Methodological naturalism. How does this play into this? Are we to assume a naturalistic explanation unless we have warrant to believe otherwise?
I wondered that in reading this article as well. Is Halverson plumping here for sort of methodological naturalism? It's not clear to me that he is. Methodological naturalism being the assumption that we should only entertain naturalistic explanations for the facts. He comes close to that, but what he's saying is that you would never have any reason to adopt a supernatural explanation over a natural explanation. He's not saying you can't have supernatural explanations in the pool of explanatory options. Say you have some data to be explained and you have a pool of, say, 5 explanatory options. He would say the naturalistic ones, no matter how improbable, no matter how outlandish, always take precedence over the supernatural one. And I simply don't see any reason to think that's true. It could well be that given the religio-historical context in which the event occurs, that the supernatural explanation might well be a much better explanation, and that our knowledge of the relevant laws of nature are such that we have a pretty good idea that this event is naturally impossible.
I've never totally gotten that. It's like, okay, should I always employ methodological naturalism or not? Because we tend to kind of be naturally skeptical of miracle claims, and aren't we just?
Yeah.
Is it a moderate naturalistic methodology, methodological naturalism, in that we don't rule out all the possible options, but we're going to look for natural explanations otherwise, or until we find reason not to. I mean, don't we all do that? Is what I'm asking you, Bill.
I think that's true. I think all things being equal, we look first for natural explanations of an event.
We don't punt immediately to...
No, of course not. And it would only be in cases where you have such a knowledge of the relevant natural causes as to be able to say with some confidence that these causes are inadequate to bring about this effect. And then there's a religio-historical context that gives good grounds for thinking that a supernatural explanation is plausible. And that would give you reasons to believe in miracles.
Okay. He goes on to say that he doesn't discount the miracles of the Bible, apparently as a Christian, because he thinks that the overriding narrative is rational to believe, and we discussed that. But Bill, how does he kind of wrap this article up? He says, thus I have claimed, on the one hand, you ought never believe that some event which occurs outside of the biblical narrative is a miracle. You might convince me that a rather surprising event occurred. I'll just deny that it's a miracle in any technical sense. On the other hand, I've also claimed that it can be rational to believe in the miracle stories of the Bible because the miracle stories in the Bible are relevantly different than the purported miracles of today. Maybe this is what he's trying to say.
Well, the problem is I think he hasn't justified that conclusion. What he said is it's rational to believe Lazarus rose from the dead, but you cannot believe that that was a miracle, he says. Similarly, what about Jesus rising from the dead? You could believe Jesus rose from the dead, but he would prohibit you saying that God raised Jesus from the dead or that that was a miracle. And he hasn't shown that the miracle stories in the Bible are relevantly different from miracles that occur today in a charged religio-historical context. I quoted him earlier saying that the miracle stories in the Bible were not intended to make the claim that an event violated the laws of nature. Well, certainly the miracle stories in the Bible are meant to make the claim that these are naturally impossible events. Think of the story of the healing of the blind man in John chapter 9, where the Pharisees try again and again to interrogate this man, to try to explain how it is that this man born blind is now seeing. And the man says, this is remarkable. Ever since the creation of the world, it has never been heard of that a man born blind has been healed. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now, I think that blind man reasoned rightly, and Hans Halverson did not.